The billionaire saw the Maid's Mafia tattoo. Then he stopped the wedding. The wedding had already begun. Alexander Blackwood stood at the altar in a black tailored suit, Victoria Sinclair beside him in white, her smile practiced and radiant. 200 guests filled the chapel. The priest, Father Thomas, opened his old leather book and began the final blessing. Then Alexander's eyes drifted to the back of the room. Elena Rossi stood near the door in her maid's uniform, holding a small tray of programs no one had asked for. She wasn't supposed to be watching the ceremony. She was supposed to be invisible. Her sleeve shifted. For half a second, a tattoo showed on the inside of her wrist. A circle wrapped around a blade, wrapped around a rose. Alexander had seen it before. Not on her. On someone else a lifetime ago. He stopped breathing. "Alexander," Victoria whispered, still smiling for the guests. He didn't answer her. He was staring at Elena, and somewhere behind his eyes, a voice he hadn't heard in 30 years surfaced without warning. His mother's voice, low, urgent, gripping his small hand. "If you ever see that mark again, don't trust the story your father told you." Alexander turned his head toward his father. Richard Blackwood, seated in the front row in an immaculate gray suit, had gone the color of chalk. "Alexander, what are you doing?" someone hissed. He stepped down from the altar. 200 guests watched a billionaire groom walk away from his own vows, straight toward the maid standing by the door. "Where did you get that mark?" he asked her. Elena said nothing. She only pulled her sleeve down slowly, like she'd done it 100 times before. 3 weeks earlier, Elena Rossi had been nobody in that house. She arrived with excellent references, a quiet manner, and a habit of working later than anyone asked her to. She kept her sleeves long even in the summer heat of the Blackwood estate, and if anyone noticed, they assumed she was simply modest. She wasn't modest. She was careful. Victoria noticed her first. Not her wrist, but her stillness. Elena never flinched when spoken to sharply, never lowered her eyes the way the other staff did. It irritated Victoria in a way she couldn't name. "You're new," Victoria had said, looking her over in the hallway. "Try not to be seen too much. Alexander doesn't like clutter before an event." Elena only nodded. Later, alone in the linen room, she pressed her fingers briefly against her own wrist, over the fabric, over the mark she never let anyone see completely. Then she went back to work. She hadn't taken this job by accident. She had studied the Blackwood household for a year before applying. She knew which rooms held old records. She knew the family had a portrait gallery that hadn't been touched in 2 decades. She was looking for something specific, and she was patient enough to wait for it. The first clue came from a hallway she wasn't supposed to be cleaning. An old photograph hung near the west staircase, half forgotten behind a taller, newer portrait of Richard. Elena moved the newer frame one afternoon to dust behind it, and there it was. Alexander's mother, younger, laughing, standing beside a dark-haired man Elena recognized instantly. She didn't gasp. She didn't touch the photograph. She simply looked at it for 3 seconds longer than she should have, then hung the newer frame back exactly where it had been. She hadn't noticed Margaret Blackwood standing at the end of the hall. Margaret's eyes moved from the photograph to Elena's wrist, where the sleeve had ridden up an inch. Her face lost its color. "Where did you say you were from?" Margaret asked quietly. "I didn't say," Elena answered, and walked away before the older woman could ask again. That night, Margaret sat alone in her study for a long time, staring at nothing. Alexander began noticing things he couldn't explain. Small things. Elena knew the names of rooms she'd never been told. She avoided Richard's study with a deliberateness that seemed too precise to be coincidence. Once, when a guest mentioned the name Rossi in passing conversation about old New York families, Elena's hand had gone still on the teapot she was pouring, just for a moment. His father's version of the past had always been simple. The Rossi family had betrayed the Blackwoods, and Richard had cut all ties to protect what remained of his own family's name. It was a story Alexander had heard since childhood, repeated so often it had calcified into fact. But facts didn't usually make his father go pale. He asked Daniel Reed, his head of security, to look into it quietly. Just the housekeeping records, Alexander told him. Where she came from. Nothing dramatic. Daniel came back 4 days later with more than housekeeping records. He came back with an old financial ledger, one Richard had buried in a filing system so outdated it hadn't been touched since before Alexander was born. There's a transfer here, Daniel said, sliding the folder across the desk. 30 years ago. Money moved out of a Rossi family trust and into an account under your father's name. Not Marco Rossi's. Your father's. Alexander stared at the page for a long time. That's not possible, he said. Rossi stole from us. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows what your father told them, Daniel said carefully. The wedding preparations continued because Alexander told himself he needed more before he could act. More proof. More certainty. He told himself this even as something cold settled permanently in his chest. Victoria, for her part, sensed the shift in him without understanding its cause. She grew sharper with Elena, correcting her over nothing, dismissing her in front of other guests. It wasn't jealousy exactly, or not only jealousy. It was instinct. Victoria had heard fragments over the years, dinner table comments from Richard that trailed off too quickly, a warning once from her own mother never to ask about the Rossi business. She didn't know the whole truth, but she knew enough to be afraid of it. 2 days before the wedding, she found Elena alone in the flower room and let her frustration finally surface. You think no one notices you watching him, Victoria said. Whatever you're playing at, it ends the moment I'm his wife. Elena set down the shears she was holding. I'm not playing at anything. Then why do you keep that wrist covered like you're hiding a wound? Elena's eyes lifted, calm and unreadable. Maybe I am. Victoria reached out and yanked the sleeve up before Elena could stop her. The tattoo was fully exposed. Circle. Blade. Rose. Victoria's face changed, not with triumph, but with something closer to dread. That's the mark, she whispered. That's the mark my mother told me never to speak of. And that was the moment Alexander walked in. He saw it clearly this time, unobstructed, undeniable. The room went very quiet. Somewhere behind his eyes, a memory surfaced whole for the first time in decades. His mother kneeling in front of him, showing him a piece of paper with the same symbol drawn on it in ink, telling him, "This mark belongs to the family that saved my life." You told me they betrayed us, Alexander said, though his father wasn't even in the room. He said it anyway, like the words had been waiting years to come out. The wedding happened 2 days later. Alexander went through with the preparations because he needed the family gathered in one place, needed his father cornered by an audience he couldn't lie in front of. It was cruel, maybe. It was also the only way he knew to force the truth into daylight. So the ceremony began. And Alexander stood at the altar and watched Elena's sleeve shift one final time. And this time he didn't hesitate. He walked to her. He asked her where she'd gotten the mark. And for the first time she decided to answer. Ask your father, she said. He knows exactly where it came from. Alexander turned toward the front row. Richard rose slowly from his seat, his composure cracking in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. Daniel stepped forward from the side of the chapel with a folder in his hand. The ledger, the transfer records, everything he'd found. Marco Rossi didn't steal from this family, Alexander said, loud enough for the guests to hear. He protected it. My mother told me that herself when I was a child, and I forgot, because you made sure I forgot. Richard said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't be a lie exposed the moment it left his mouth. Margaret rose from her seat, her voice trembling but clear. The Rossi family stood between your mother and the men who tried to kill her, Alexander. Marco Rossi took a bullet meant for her. That mark was the seal of the pact between our families. Your father hid the truth because he was the one who stole from them, and framed Marco for it so no one would ever ask why. Elena's voice, when it finally came, was quiet, but the chapel was silent enough to carry it to every corner. My father died in prison for a crime he never committed. My mother died running. I came here because I believed the evidence still existed somewhere in this house. I didn't come for revenge. I came for the truth. Father Thomas stepped forward then, holding a yellowed envelope he had kept locked away for over 2 decades, given to him by Alexander's mother before she died. She asked me to give this to her son, he said, if he ever needed it. Alexander opened it with unsteady hands. The letter was short. If my son ever sees the Rossi mark again, tell him this. The Rossi family did not betray us. They protected us. If anyone ever tells you otherwise, ask who benefited from their disappearance. He read it twice. Then he looked at his father, and Richard had no answer left in him. None at all. Victoria touched his arm. Alexander, please. Whatever this is, we can deal with it after. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that look she understood everything he wasn't saying. He slid the ring from his finger, gently, without anger. I was about to marry someone who knew my family was built on a lie, he said. I can't do that. He turned to Elena, standing where she had always stood, at the edges of a room that had never once seen her clearly. You came here looking for the truth, Alexander said. I'm going to help you find it. She didn't smile, not yet. There was too much still unfinished for that. But she nodded, and for the first time since she'd walked into that house, she let her sleeve fall still, uncovered, the mark visible to everyone. Alexander looked at it one last time. It wasn't a mafia symbol anymore. It never really had been. It was the mark of the man who had once saved his mother's life, and the daughter who had spent hers trying to bring him justice.